welcome to the very first episode of the HERBGARDEN knitwear podcast. My name is Hanna and I'm the maker and designer behind HERBGARDEN knitwear, and I'm so happy that you are here today to join me chatting about knitting and everything fiber related. Since this is the very first episode, I would like to give you a little introduction about myself. I started knitting about 6 or 7 years ago, just to relax when I was at university. I started with the simple 2x2 rib headband to learn the knit stitch and the purl stitch, and I got addicted very, very quickly. I very soon discovered the Very Pink Knits podcast, which helped me a lot to learn new techniques, and I dived into garment knitting rather quickly. I still remember the very first cardigan that I made was a free pattern from Lion Brand yarn. It was a raglan design shirt, I guess, or a cardigan, short-sleeved, and I modified it heavily. I added like a lace pattern and made long sleeve that had decreases to make it a little smaller around the cuff, and I was addicted so very quickly with knitting, and I can never imagine to stop it. I am a very big fan of knitting podcasts. I love to see the projects people are working on, the finished objects and all the lovely yarn acquisitions. I'm really enjoying that. And I first thought I would like to do a similar thing, but I don't think that is a very good idea. That is because I am a monogamous knitter. I only ever work at one project at a time, so I would only be able to show you one single thing for several episodes, and I think that would get boring very quickly. So what I would like to do in addition to showing you my work in progress, I would like to give you a little bit of knitting tips at the end of each episode. So there are so many things that I've learned over the past years that I would have hoped to know earlier. So I hope by sharing these things that I've learned, you will get a little help with your own knitting and maybe a little inspiration. So I have many things in mind for future episodes, but in this episode I would like to talk about yarn substitution, and I hope that is something that you will find interesting. But first of all, I would like to show you what I'm wearing today. This is one of the first summer tees I released. This is my Jantje Tee. Jantje is a girl's name in the region where I grew up. And it has these lovely ruffle sleeves and this little stitch detail running along the side. And I will hope that I can give you a little close-up by standing up so that you can see the stitch detail a little bit better. There are these beautiful eyelets here and some garter ridges. This pattern is available on Ravelry, and I knit this tee by holding two strands of Sandnes Line together, which is a yarn that combines linen and cotton, and it's just perfect for summer projects. So next up, I would like to show you what I'm currently working on. So this is a project that I have already shown on Instagram before, where you also can find me as HERBGARDEN knitwear. And this project is named my Fiber Artist Sweater. And it has this lovely colorwork panel, both in the front and in the back. And it has like the square neckline. Sorry, there are still like all the ends sticking out because I haven't weaved them in yet. And the neckline is finished off with the very lovely I-cord. This I-cord actually gave me a little bit of trouble. I had tried to do the neckline before, and I don't know why, but it didn't look neat at all, so I had to set this project aside for a little bit, but I'm so glad I picked it up again. And the second time I used a different technique. I actually picked up all the stitches around the whole neckline, and then I worked the I-cut and bound the stitches off at the same time, and now I think the result is just like I wanted. It's very neat and beautiful. And right now I'm working on the ribbing at the bottom. The sweater is currently a little bit tight on the bottom because my needle is still in here. And I decided for the rib that I want to work some short rows. So this is the front, and in the back you can see that the ribbing is much longer because I wanted to go a little bit longer over your back. And I have finished the first sleeve. It has this lovely garter-rich detail here at the cuff. And as soon as I have finished the rib on the bottom, I will do the second sleeve, and then we'll see how this goes. The yarn that I'm using for this sweater is Garn Loch Lomond. It is GOTS certified organic wool, and it has 150 meter per 50 grams. And I'm not sure if you can see that, but it has all these lovely tweed speckles in here. Like there's a little bit of pink and a little bit of yellow. I really like this yarn a lot. I used it for several other projects already, like for my Boughs of Holly sweater, which is a green and white colorwork sweater with an all-over colorwork pattern. It's also a circular yoke sweater. And also for the season greeting hat, which is a hat with the traditional Fair Isle snowflake motif on the side. You can find both of these patterns in my Ravelry store. And I am currently writing the pattern for the tee that you can see behind me. I recently found a name for it, which took me quite some time, which happens very often. Finding a name for things is usually the hardest part for me. But this tee always reminds me of a sunset at the beach because of the deep red and the blues. And this is why I decided to call it Sunkissed Sea. And the tee is made with a linen stitch, which has like a gorgeous texture to it. And I hope I can insert a little bit of a close-up for you in this clip. So the red color slowly transitions into this brighter blue, and then it once again transitions into the deep, darker blue. And I really love the effect of the little gradient that I created by changing colors in a certain way. I knit this tee last summer, and it took me quite some time to get the pattern ready because when I first wrote it, I had written down the entire instructions up until the point where you separate for body and sleeves. And then I only afterwards realized that I forgot to incorporate the color change into the instructions, which of course is a major part of this design. So I kind of was really frustrated because I had to write all the instructions again. So it took me a little while, like about 6 months from last summer to now, which is April 2022, to get back into things, find my motivation to do it. But now I'm almost done with the pattern, and I'm so happy that I picked it up again because I really love this design, and I hope that it will can go into tech editing in the week after Easter, I hope, or the week after that, so in the end of April. And yeah, maybe the test knit can start around the beginning of May or something like that. We will see how that goes. So now I would like to talk a little bit about how I substitute yarn. Every now and then you really want to make a pattern and the suggested yarn is just not available to you, either because you cannot get your hands on it where you live, or it is too expensive for what you can afford, or for any other reason. So you have to find a different yarn that you can use for the pattern. And there is a strategy I would suggest that you can use to find a yarn that is really suitable for that pattern. So maybe you already made the experience that you knit a pattern from a designer and you had exact the same gauge as stated in the pattern, and still the garment or the shawl or whatever you knit did turn out quite differently than you felt the sample of the designer looked. And that can be because of your yarn choice. It can be for other reasons as well, but the yarn choice is definitely something that does play a big part in a design. And I would always suggest to try to find a yarn that is very, very similar to the suggested yarn in the pattern. So now, how do I do this? Well, first of all, I try to find some yarns that are similar to the suggested one. And I will share in a few minutes what similar means exactly. But I usually use the website YarnSub, where you can simply enter the yarn that is suggested in the pattern, and then you will get like a list of suggestions that might be similar to the one you entered. And I will try to insert a little bit of screen recording here so that you can get an impression of how that website works. So if you enter the suggested yarn, then you will get some suggestions, and I would not just use those suggestions, but you can get a first impression of what yarns might be suitable, and then you can narrow that suggestion down by going through the attributes that we'll share in a minute. And the other way I try to find a substitute yarn is, of course, using Ravelry. If the pattern you want to knit is knit by many other people, then you will find the little tab on the pattern page that says yarn ideas. And you will find a list of yarns that other people have used for the pattern, and you can check if there's any yarn there who fits the criteria that we want to have. Or you can also go the other way around. You can go to the yarn search of Ravelry, enter the suggested yarn that is given in the pattern, and then you can have a look at what other projects people made with that suggested yarn. And then you can see if for these other projects people also used a different kind of yarn, or what was the suggested yarn for these other projects that people knit with the yarn. So you can kind of search both ways. I hope that made sense. So this is the way I find potentially suitable yarns, and then I want to narrow this yarn list down to match the attributes of the suggested yarn in my pattern. So maybe this is easier to understand if we do it with an example. Let's just say, for demonstration purposes, you want to knit a pattern, and the suggested yarn in the pattern is Drops Charisma. This yarn is a 100% woolen yarn with 100 meters per 50 grams. Let's just say this is the yarn suggested in the pattern, and now you want to find a substitute for this yarn. So the very first thing I would check the potential substitute yarns for is that they have the same length to weight ratio. So this one, as I said, had 50 grams and 100 meters. So I want the substitute yarn to be very, very, very similar, if not the same. So if you have a yarn that has like 50 grams and 200 meters, it would definitely be way too fine for the pattern that you want to make. Or if it has like 50 meters per 50 grams, then it would be much too thick for the pattern. So this is the very first thing that you need to check, the length to weight ratio of the yarn. The second thing that you should check is, of course, the material of the yarn, because it has a huge impact of the resulting fiber, of the resulting fabric, sorry. And this yarn here was 100% wool, which you can always find all these informations on the yarn bed. No matter if it's a commercial yarn or an indie dyed yarn, you will always have like this information on the wall band or on the website of the designer, of the website of the dyer, I meant. You will always be able to find this information. So the fiber content is really important for the resulting fabric, and you would never want to mix like plant fibers and animal fibers. So if the pattern suggests a yarn that is 100% animal fibers, I would never use a substitute yarn that is 100% plant fibers. You can sometimes, depending on the pattern, vary a little bit, but the safest way is always to use exactly the same fiber type as suggested in the pattern. So this is the second thing that you should look out for. And then there's a third thing that is maybe a little more complicated, but that can also heavily have an effect on the resulting fabric that you will get. And that is the amount of plies that you have in a yarn. So maybe we can have a look here. This yarn, if we untwist it, then you might be able to see that it has 4 plies. And the yarn that you want to use as a substitute should have a similar amount of plies. And then you can have a look at the yarn and see how tightly it is twisted. So how much twist does the thread have? That is also something that is very helpful to know if you want to find a substitute yarn. And the last thing is, if you want to really get a perfect result, absolutely matching the suggested yarn, then you can check whether the yarn that you have is woolen or worsted spun. A woolen spun yarn is very light and airy. It has many pockets of air because the fibers are very, they kind of go all ways. And if you have a worsted spun yarn, the fibers are kind of all in the same direction, which gives you a much denser and tighter and smoother yarn. So if you would take the same amount of yarn and have half of it a woolen spun and the other half worsted spun, then the 2 skeins you would get would have a total different size. The woolen spun skein would be very big, very bouncy, airy and fluffy, and the worsted spun skein would be much smaller, very dense, and if you knit it up, it would have a much more, you would get a much more drapey fabric, which is because the fiber is so much denser, so much smoother, and you would also want to use a worsted spun yarn for something that has a lot of like for socks, like you want, if you wear your socks very, very much, you would probably want to use a worsted spun yarn, not a woolen spun yarn, whereas a woolen spun would be lovely for a very warm winter sweater. So what I was trying to say, if you want to substitute the yarn, you should also look if the type of the way it was spun is woolen spun or worsted spun, and so that you can match your substitute yarn to match the suggested yarn. So let's get back to our example. So if we want to find a substitute for this Drops Charisma, I have 2 yarns here that could be potential substitutes. Let's have a look at them. The first one is Let Lopi, which is also 100% wool, just as we are looking for, and also 50 grams and 100 meters, so the exact same length to weight ratio that we want to have. But if we have a look at like the thread here, you can see if I untwist it, there are only 2 plies here, and the yarn is much more loosely twisted than the Drops Charisma. And the second one that I have here is a Rain Cloud and Sage yarn. It's called Origin, and it's dyed by Mominoki. And it also is a 100% woolen yarn, and it has 100 grams and 200 meters, which is the exact same ratio. So if you divide these 2 numbers by 2, then you get 50 grams and 100 meters, which was exactly the ratio that we are looking for. And if you have a look at this yarn and how it is twisted, you will see that it is much more similar to the Drops Charisma than the Plötulopi was. So if I hold them up here together, you hopefully will be able to see that the amount of twist in this yarns is very, very different. So if I compare it once again with the first one, I hope you'll be able to see that these 2 here are much more similar than these 2. So this is how I try to narrow down the choices of potential substitutes. And then, of course, you still have to gauge swatch. There's no way around that. So if you have found a yarn with the correct length to weight ratio and the same fiber type and the same kind of twist and the same amount of plies, or at least a similar amount of plies, then you would swatch, and then you would see if you actually can use this yarn with the pattern. So this is what I kind of do when I try to find a substitute yarn. And I really hope that this is helpful for you. Of course, it requires a little bit of understanding what different attributes the different fiber types have, but that is something that you can easily look up on the internet. Maybe we can make another episode someday where I share a little bit about the different attributes of the different fiber types. Yeah, so I guess that was everything for the first episode. My friend Laura from Penrose Knits, who also has a very, very inspiring and awesome knitting podcast, has a lovely tradition at the end of every of her episodes. She spotlights small designers, other podcasters and knitters, and I really love that idea because we all should support each other in this community, and I really love to discover new knitters through podcasts. So I hope it is okay if I do the same thing. And today I would like to introduce you to Gabriella of Merriweather Knitting. She also has a lovely knitting podcast, which I find totally inspiring. So whenever you have a bad day, Gabriella will certainly put a smile on your face. She is such a passionate and lovely person. She is super kind, and she recently released her very first design, which is a lovely shawl, the Calville shawl. And I will try to insert a picture right here so you can see it. It has a very lovely texture and is a triangular shawl, and I think for a very, very first design, this is absolutely stunning, and you should definitely check her out. So I guess that this was everything for the very first episode. I really hope you enjoyed it, and I would be very happy if you would consider subscribing, even though this is the very first episode. And if you have any feedback for me at all, please leave me a comment below. I would love to hear your thoughts, and if you found my tips on yarn substitution helpful at all. Thank you so much for spending this time with me, and I really hope I will see you next time. Bye!